This week, we're jumping back into last week's conversation with some of our favorite podcasters. As our co host Paul notes, this last year was a terrible year for many things, but great for podcasting. Listen in and get a behind the scenes view of what was the inspiration behind these podcasts, and here's some very practical advice and wisdom for publishing your own. Kicking things off is our very own Dr. Jonathan Searcy with the Perry Pod. And as last week, all podcasts will be linked in the description. Thanks for listening. I'd love to know, Dr. Searcy, if you would share a little bit about your podcast and what brought you into producing it.
I make a podcast called The Perry Pod. It is about the television show from the 1950s and 60s, Perry Mason. It is the interwebs only podcast dedicated exclusively to reviewing all 250 plus episodes of the Perry Mason television program. I'm dedicating one episode per episode. And at this point, I still haven't made it out of the second season. And I'm 60 plus episodes in to give you a sense of how long those television seasons were. So that's the idea. I am making a recap and analysis episode per television episode. And I have at this point covered two of the made-for-TV movies that came out in the 1980s as well, when they got the whole gang back together. So Perry Mason.
That's pretty impressive. You've got a lot of material. We have a lot of episodes yet to go through, it seems like.
Well, if I do one a week, I still won't finish this bad boy for another 4.5 years. And at this pace, I have not been doing one a week. So I hope to complete it before our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ comes.
Impressive. What was it that, first, what drew you into the world of Perry Mason? And second, what spurred you onward to create a podcast about it?
I have loved Perry Mason ever since I was 10 years old. Not being able to watch primetime television growing up, I gravitated to the world of syndicated television, and Perry Mason was on for 4 hours a day on WGN and TBS. And so I watched the show, not religiously, but certainly semi-religiously growing up. And it was something my parents really dug to. So it was something I could bond with them over. A lot of the culture that I loved when I was growing up were not things that my parents dug. So this was like the rare place where I could dig something that they also dug, which I think they probably appreciated too. I then discovered that the show was based on a series of novels. So being an English major, somebody who ended up getting his PhD in English Lit, my fun reads are Earl Stanley Gardner novels. So Earl Stanley Gardner, according to the Guinness Book of World Records, was at one time the best-selling mystery author of all time. Over 80 plus Perry Mason novels. They're delightful in their own way. They are certainly not copies of the show. And the best episodes, in my opinion, tend to be based on the novels. So that was another world for me to dive into, not only 250 plus episodes of the show, but 80 plus novels to read. And then in the summer of 2018, that was right before I started my work here at Southern Wesleyan. And I felt, correctly so, that it was a new season for me. And something I wanted to do was stop thinking about or consuming culture, but actually like giving something back or producing something in response to all the culture I consumed. And Perry Mason was the thing I knew the most about. And so I made it up as I was going along, and delightfully called my father and my aunt to be my first dedicated subscribers and listeners. And I'm happy to say now that a bunch of complete strangers have found the podcast and dig Perry Mason as much as I do. It has been a blessing to not only have something to connect with my father and aunt about, but also to commiserate is negative, but to connect with people across the country who love this show as much as I do. I would say that it also reveals that my soul is 85 years old at heart. A MeTV watcher forever is the soul of mine, even though my body is only 40 years old. So
I love that. And you lead perfectly into the next question. Your audience obviously is intended for fans of Perry Mason. Have you been able to connect with listeners? Maybe they've messaged you or contacted you, and have you been surprised by some connections you've made through the podcast?
Yeah, at this point, the episodes get downloaded, maybe 1,000, 1,200 episode downloads happen per month, which is kind of crazy when you think about it. For me, it is, at least, especially when there were maybe 50 downloads per month for like the first year and a half. So definitely more people are listening to it than were when I first started. And I've set the podcast up with a couple prompts that invite people to write things in. So in each episode, if you know the cast of the show, there were 3 constant good characters. There's Perry Mason, of course, the hero defense attorney, his faithful secretary, Della Street, and then his private investigator, Paul Drake. So in each episode, I focus on something we learn about Perry Mason. The Della is what I call the deep dive into a particular actor or actress who appeared in an episode, and I unearth lots of funky stuff that I didn't know about. And then I basically come up with a prompt that I call a Paul prompt to promote our own private investigator gene. So in a particular episode, the plot was built around a bunch of money that was in the Philippines that the U.S. was supposed to have burned so that the Japanese couldn't get a hold of it. And so I asked, Paul prompt for this episode, is this based on facts? Like, did the American government ever license the burning of millions of dollars to avoid having an enemy grab that money and then use it for nefarious means? Because of those prompts, I get crazy emails with responses and research. So the answer to that question is yes. In the aftermath of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, Hawaii's money was replaced with special Hawaii bucks that had a stamp on the back of it, indicating that at any time that money could be negated. And as a result, after the Second World War ended, the U.S. government had to collect over $500 million of doubled up currency, this special Hawaii money, and had to requisition sugar plants to burn it. There was so much of it. And that's like a deep dive that I found out because a listener, my father in this particular case, went out and found that stuff. And so, yeah, I have connected with people, and there are people out there who know a whole lot about Perry Mason. And I'm glad that at this point, nobody has written in to tell me I've stopped listening to your podcast because you don't know anything about Perry Mason. Even the diehard fans have been able to find something, and that's gratifying to me.
Wow, I am very impressed. Is the typical format you will watch an episode and then take some notes on that episode as you rewatch and then present that information after a little bit of research?
Yeah, so one of my formal dilemmas was, how do I make an episode that isn't just me talking for an unbroken 30-minute amount of time, especially since I don't have confidence in myself to ad-lib for 30 minutes. So I'm writing out a script for every single episode. I have not had guests. So the first thing I do is I watch the episode. I sort of make notes because I want to have a Paul prompt. I've got to find something in the episode that would be worth researching. For instance, there was this automatic putting machine. You putt into it and it spits the ball back out. this is a 1960 episode. I'm like, is this thing a new invention? And the answer is no. It was around in the early 1910s. So that's my Paul prompt. I want to find an actor or actress I can focus on, something about Perry. I give what I call a Perry proverb, which is a specific quotation from Perry that shows his wisdom, sort of sums up his wisdom in the episode. And my real insight was to use the audio from the show, clips from the show throughout, as well as sort of musical stings to punctuate the different sections. So in every episode, I review some matter of the law. I call it the legal library. I review the plot. I review the plot of a novel if it was based on the novel, and there's a lot of differences sometimes. I give trivia. I talk about a theme. I then talk about a Perry proverb, and finally I end up by going to what I call the water cooler, where I give feedback from listeners as well as a review of what people found in response to the last Paul prompt.
That's some good counsel that you provide just for someone who is starting out with podcasting or just wanting to get into that world and being very purposeful in that. What other guidance or wisdom would you give to somebody who's thinking about starting their own podcast?
You won't know what you need to do until you start doing it. And so I don't think what I've made with the Perry Pod is like the extent of my podcasting abilities. But I know that if there's a podcast that I want to make in the future, especially being a teacher, like an educational resource, I know so much more now about how to do that well as a result of simply pursuing this hobby. I haven't made any money from it. It's been nice to receive feedback, but even if my dad and aunt were the only people who listened to it, I've learned more about something I love. I have been able to connect, and I think my dad and aunt really enjoy it. Like, they like hearing me, and they like hearing their names when I read their names in the podcast. Like, it's been a gift. And so I know that I personally have benefited from 15 or 20 different podcasts that have been a companion to me as I've gone through various books or movies. And so it does my heart good to be able to give back to people who love this show and want to learn more about it. That to me is the thing. I think it's been a real joy.
That's great. And also a recurring theme that everyone seems to have when it comes to starting your own podcast is just jump in with both feet. Don't delay. Don't let anything hold you back as far as technical requirements or thoughts. Just out of curiosity, what do you use to record, edit, host your podcast?
I use Libsyn, Libsyn, as a podcasting host. I have a Blue Yeti mic that I record my script on. I use Audacity as a freeware program to splice together the music and clips from the show as well as my own script. It's pretty low maintenance, man. In parts of the show only came about because I started doing it and somebody pointed some things out to me that could be better. But even in terms of the level of the microphone, I know there are audiophiles out there who know the difference between my Blue Yeti mic and if I were just recording open air into the microphone of that's inside my laptop. I certainly couldn't. And so if that's all that's standing in your way, go ahead and start.
Yeah, great counsel. Well, in closing, any other thoughts or wisdom for a listener or any podcast that you particularly find inspiring personally that you listen to?
I have to admit that I don't like podcasts that are like mine, that are a single voice. And I prefer conversations. So the Tim Ferriss podcast or Moments with Bryant Koppelman Moments That Matter with Scott Williams and Paul Schatzberger. Because of that, I like dialogue. I like the interchange that happens between two voices. And as a result of that, my own podcast is geared towards making sure that it's never just me. And I think that's one of the things people respond to. The clips actually help, not just in terms of letting you know that in many ways, what made Perry Mason great is it could have been a radio drama just as much as a television drama. But because the reason you're listening to the podcast is not my voice, you love Raymond Burr's voice, or the voice of Hamilton Burker as he gets overruled after a silly objection. And so finding a way to include parts of what you love in the podcast is essential. And I think that's what people respond to.
So let me flip the tables on you and Paul Scott, because I'm a host at heart, because you guys are the ones that put this together. Same questions that you guys asked us. How did Moments That Matter come together?
I was writing a book that turned into Moments That Matter. And it was just this idea. It actually comes from Parker Palmer, who is an amazing author. And the idea is that we have these moments that come along that in his tradition, major decisions or whatever, that they would get together in sort of an elder circle, and they would just simply ask questions of this individual who was facing this life choice. And as a result of that, their ideas would be solidified, and they would have confidence moving forward. And so we said, maybe we don't have a committee, but maybe we have these moments anyway, and so we can talk about those moments. And yeah, I have to say that, at least for my part, this is incredibly self-indulgent, because I think actually one of the things that Scott and I share in common is that we are just interested in everything, and we just talk about everything. And so if we can listen to an author, or we can listen to a doctor, or we can listen to a financial expert, or we can it doesn't really matter. We just want to find out stuff and learn stuff. So some of the guests that we've had on, it's been a very winding road to that person. I can think about, we had someone come to Southern Wesleyan to speak at chapel who had just written a book about C.S. Lewis. And the way I found out about her was I just literally stumbled across her dissertation. And so she was invited to Southern Wesleyan, and we said, we could just have her as a guest. And so she was a guest. And so, stuff like that happens all the time. And we are interested in authors. We are interested in people who kind of want to get out there just a little bit. I just attended a writers conference for Christian writers, and there was someone who's interested in being on a podcast, and so we're going to interview her on Monday. So it's just all these connections. We've had twice now a couple that are professional bluegrass musicians and writers. And it's only because I've known the guy since he was in second grade. And we used to live with them in the summers when we came back from Ukraine, when we were missionaries. And so these people sort of become friends, and it's actually pretty cool. And we're going to actually try something maybe this summer, maybe in the fall, I'm not sure. Very first time, we're going to try to take the podcast on location and go to one of the outdoor festivals that this couple is going to do. And we're going to interview the people who attend and, what got you interested in, this group, and also bluegrass in general. And so, yeah, I think that'll be kind of fun. So we're getting into other stuff as well as what we've been doing.
I totally agree. I'd back up just a little bit further for myself personally. Heath, you mentioned the SWU chapels. I realized when I started here at SWU, I'm much like Deborah. I love podcasts, and I'll listen to podcasts about all kinds of different crazy stuff just out of intrigue, because I spent so much time on the road, and it was a great companion to listen to. I love listening to audiobooks. And so when I started here at SWU about 5 years ago, I thought, we've got these great chapel services that are being recorded, but they're not in a format where people can just listen to the audio of them without going on to YouTube. And I thought, all the content's there already. All I have to do is just convert it. So I found a free hosting site, and it was one that our church used, that I converted our services from church. And that sort of got me into the other side of things. And so then Paul had this great idea about moments that matter. And it was just a perfect match in the way that things unfolded. And so it was a really great start, because I really wanted to do something that was maybe making some content other than just taking what was already done. I think there's so much amazing content, especially when it comes to archives and gifts for the future, that really it opens up the world and makes it accessible. One of our chapel services, I'll go every once in a while and look and see where people are listening from. And there was a hit in Dublin, Ireland for a SWU chapel. There was a hit over in Africa, a couple people on the West Coast listening. And so it's just amazing to think we truly have the only limit that we have by way of audience is just access to technology globally. And so I think that's the great, great, great gift. I can't imagine what the early Christians would have thought if they had been given a word of prophecy that one day you can speak something in your midst that will be accessible to every ear around the world as they have access to technology. And so it's a great responsibility. It's a great gift. It's a great opportunity. And I think it's just incredible that here in our little corner of the world, we have so much great content and great individuals sharing.
So right now I'm reading the book called The Circle Maker by Mark Batterson. I've read it several times, but there's actually a story in there. I haven't gotten to it, but we would interview him every year on the Techology Show. And it was kind of like a standing thing. Hey, when your next book comes out, come be on our show. And we built a really good relationship with him. Well, one of the interviews, we're telling him this story about Bob Bagley and something that happened on the mission field. And it's in his book. Like he talks about, hey, I was doing an interview and they told me this story and mentions the missionary, I think it mentions, and it's just like, wait a minute. And so you never know. I mean, you're talking about, we're just kind of chit-chatting before we hit record on the podcast. I mean, I may or may not be mentioning a best-selling book, but, but it's crazy. It's crazy.
2020 was a terrible year to start a restaurant. But it was a great year to start a podcast. And I don't know if y'all pay attention to your statistics, how much you do that. But I tell you what, in October, it was amazing the number of hits that we were getting. And I think things had just settled in enough that people were just like, I need something. I don't know what it is, but deliver me, please, And I was listening to, someone on the radio talking this morning about, what is it that's going to stick around from the pandemic? What is the new normal? And I have to believe that listening to podcasts is going to be part of that new normal. It was sort of becoming that way anyway. But then people just understood, this is like companionship, this is a way to maintain my sanity. But maybe they haven't made that sort of last leap to say, not only can I listen, but I can actually do. And if you don't know anything about the tech, yeah, absolutely. You can probably get on top of it, relatively quickly. but you can also team up with somebody who does know. And that would be like my situation with Scott, because Scott is just an amazing editor, and we can do these shows, and I can say, Scott, do your magic, and it just, boom, there it is, So there's lots of ways to go about it. And I would also say that, if not for the podcast, I wouldn't have met you all in different ways. How about that? And so we become multidimensional people instead of unidimensional, and that's really awesome. And so I've been personally blessed by doing the podcast.
One thing I wanted to just interject in there is I was hearing you guys talk, which is so interesting. And if I was asking a question to the group, when I was hearing Heath talk, you mentioned the idea of like it's almost a lifestyle for you. For someone that's done it for so long, it's a part of your lifestyle. But then when you and Michaela were talking about the magic of turning on the microphone, it's like in the midst of your lifestyle, it's like you press record and you go into game time mode. It's like the difference between like when you're practicing or you might be shooting hoops every once in a while versus like, okay, there's let's raise the stakes. Let's go on and see what happens, when we kind of put that little tension and pressure on there. So it was a beautiful kind of picture of like, it's like a daily rhythm to make sure that you're engaging in life and trying to bring your best forward and see what God wants to do and make out of those magical moments. So that was just my thought process, but I'm still newer to the podcasting world. Has there been anything else for you guys that has been what you would say beautiful or what you've learned through podcasting that was worth sharing, like reflections on this engaging in this way?
Yeah, Brent, I was just thinking about this actually. One of the things that I've really learned in interviewing, folks is people want to talk about issues and people want to talk about books and events and things like that. They are super hesitant to talk about themselves. And, this is moments that matter. And so, yeah, we are interested in your book, and yeah, we are interested in, what you do on a daily basis in your work or something like that. But we want to know how you got here, and all that decision process and everything else like that. And that's been, I don't want to overstate this, but that's been kind of a self-realization for some people, because we give words to people, like clearness committee moment or something like this. And people go, right, actually, you know what, that did happen, and so it's been kind of great for the guests too, short of just, advertising something or other that they're doing or whatever. And honestly, it's created friendships and relationships for us too. Some people that we just want to go back and talk to because we find them fascinating, and they've had amazing lives.
Do you think that's different with podcasting, Paul, and people feeling like what they have to offer? Because I find that in friendships, when I ask them questions about themselves, some people don't like it, but I find a lot of people do enjoy talking about themselves or long for people to ask and to talk about themselves. So do you think that's different based off the platform too?
Well, as you say with your basketball analogy, it's just raising the stakes because now other people are listening. And if they've got something to represent, like a book, right? They want to come across in a certain particular way. So when you start delving in to the personal stuff, it's just like, I don't know if I really want to talk about, I will just give a really quick example on this. This bit of serendipity that was just gold for us, because we want to talk about, clearness committee moments, and that comes out of a particular tradition, a church tradition. But nobody knows what a clearness committee is, including us. In terms of just our background or something like that. But we were talking to this bluegrass couple, and she's from that tradition, and she said, we have been in a clearance committee, like a real clearance committee.
Wow.
Because we announced that we were going to get married, and they said, we need to have a clearance committee, and the guy who has no experience with this was like, oh, well, this is like a wedding shower, or, they're going to be encouraging us and, you can do it, and they were asking these really hard questions and just like, oh no, so that was complete serendipity. And that's what I also love about these interviews and such.
Have you guys found, like, one of the reasons I encourage people to podcast is I have found it helps you become a better speaker. It helps you formulate your thoughts. And I have found just in the time I've been podcasting, I've become a more confident and comfortable, when I'm preparing a message. And that's, man, what a great way to practice your messages. You hit record and go down the road and say what you need to say and then kind of listen back to it. So I didn't know if that had been the case for anybody else.
Oh yeah, that's definitely been the case for me in like crafting and formulating thoughts that I have on different topics. And I even work things out as I speak them. And so I found that like I'm working things out in my own messages as I'm speaking them, but also what I realized when the record is taken off is that I was just able to articulate that message because it was a piece of me. Like it's been able to settle within my heart to where as I talk through these podcasts, there's an obvious like mission in my language that I've been able to see. And so honestly, it gives me a look at myself and what God has been doing in my heart. So it's no longer just like messages that we're preaching, but like it is things that God has placed on my heart that are a part of who he has made me to be and what he's made me passionate about. And so while yes, it's making me a better speaker, but it's also helping me to realize that the things that I am passionate about speaking about are not just because they're fun to speak about, but because they're a part of what God has placed in my heart, seeds that he has planted in me that I'm passionate about. And so that's been really cool to go back and look or finish a podcast and say, wow, like that was just an open process with scripture involved and with other people involved where our hearts were just open. And that's been a really cool experience for me. So yeah.
I'm learning from this podcast that apparently I like sports analogies, but it makes sense in my head that it's almost like doing reps or scrimmages towards a game as well. In my head, like as a communicator. So as a communicator, it sounds like you're saying that podcasts allow you to have kind of scrimmages or reps to where it just makes sense. You get more comfortable in certain settings as you're doing that, which is brilliant.
I'm just appreciative for you guys putting this together and hopefully, our SWU, network. We're not an official podcast network, but hopefully it continues to grow. We're all kind of sharing different stories and different niches, and it's just an exciting time. And so, man, I just pray for great success for everybody, and I think God's going to use all of us to reach people and encourage and inspire people.
That's awesome. Agreed in every way. Well, thank you all so very much. I echo those prayers. Thanks for listening to Moments That Matter, a podcast that looks at the moments in our lives that come along from time to time that have consequences long after the moment, especially those moments that have to do with the choice of vocation. In his book, Let Your Life Speak, Listening for the Voice of Vocation, Parker Palmer speaks of a clearness committee in the Quaker tradition, wherein a group of older, wiser people ask questions of someone considering a life choice as a way of clarifying the next step. We may not meet with a committee about these big decisions, but we all have these critical junctures in our lives, which we can think of as clearness committee moments. We need to pay attention to these moments because they are profound and potentially life-altering. We'll relay stories from our lives and interview others about theirs, especially noting the clearness committee moments, those we choose to recognize and those that were sadly ignored, those decisions that were made with God in mind and those that were not. Our hope is that these podcasts will cause you to think of the same kind of moments in your life with new clarity.